Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today we are speaking with Mr. Walid Farwana about his article, The History of the Islamic State. Mr. Farwana is a researcher, writer, and amateur historian who has traveled throughout the Middle East and speaks fluent Arabic. You can follow his work on Twitter at The Late Empire. For more information, see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/ISIS-history. Walid, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Sure, our pleasure. So, obviously, there's a lot of ground to cover with this topic, but can you just start out by giving our listeners an overview of the various religious and ethnic groups in Iraq and kind of how the Iraqi tribal system is set up in addition to the overall structure of Iraq?
Yeah, sure. So I'm guessing, as most of your audience knows, there are essentially, at this point, three main factions in Iraq, which are the Kurds, who are in northern mountainous areas, and then you have your Sunnis, who are in the western Iraq, northern Iraq, and then you have your Shia, who are in the Baghdad area, as well as southern Iraq. And as I'm also guessing that your audience knows, is these three groups have been at war with one another since roughly 2004 until present. And the Iraqi tribal system is something which is mostly related to the Sunni Iraqis, given that their social fabric was so compromised during the U.S. occupation and war that they basically broke down to the tribal level. And the tribal system is essentially a sort of like a small kingdom of sorts, where you have these tribal leaders, and there will be a tribal head, and he's anointed by his heredity, or is hereditarily anointed into a position of power. And you have these tribal confederations and all these different complicated sort of political groupings in the region. And these guys have basically, the tribal side of Iraq has basically been the womb from which Islamic State ideologues have nursed and grown. So that's why the tribal system is important. Now, this tribal system extends into eastern Syria as well, which is why you see in eastern Syria a pretty large obviously you have the capital of ISIS in Raqqa is in Syria, and really this is kind of like the substrate from which ISIS feeds off of. So, that about covers it as just a broad overview.
Could you explain who Abu Musab Al-Zarqawi was, and what is the JTJ?
So JTJ was, I could pronounce it in Arabic, it's Jama'at al-Tawheed wal-Jihad, which was Abu Musab al-Zarqawi's organization when he first came to Iraq around 2002. And this was like the first incarnation of ISIS in that region. So around 2002, you had Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who was a Afghanistan-based mujahid, or mujahideen, or whatever you want to call him. He was a contemporary of bin Laden, but not necessarily directly associated with him. He had Afghanistan back in the 90s was basically what Iraq and Syria are today, but much more disorganized. There were many very radical Islamic groups in Afghanistan who had stuck around after the end of the Soviet invasion, and who were carving up Afghanistan into these, emirates, essentially, where they were creating their Islamic utopias. And Abu Musab al-Zarqawi was one of these guys who had gone over to Afghanistan, and he essentially shared this, you could call it Salafi ideology, which is this militant variant, kind of, I view it as Gulf Arab sort of imperialism, in a sense, in that it's like this very militant version of Islam, very extremist. So when you think about ISIS, like beheading people in the deserts and doing all the things that they do that they're famous for now, it really stems from this Salafi ideology, which calls for this type of decor and behavior, which is identical to that practiced by the Prophet Muhammad and his contemporaries in the 7th century AD. So you have these people in 2016 who are essentially acting like people from an ancient era. And they do this because they view these teachings as the purest Islamic teachings. And so that's why, that's who Abu Musab al-Zarqawi was. He was essentially this Afghan-based cultist who saw a power vacuum emerging in Iraq as the United States was threatening to invade. He touched down in Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan, around 2002, set up base in Iraq, started the JTJ, and over time he became much more infamous for his attacks on Shia and on the U.S. military presence there.
Okay, yeah. Can you build on that a little bit? Sort of how he rose in stature and prominence, and how his organization rose in stature and eventually became Al-Qaeda in Iraq and became affiliated with Al-Qaeda Central.
Sure. So he was essentially one of the most, if not the most extreme of the self-professed Sunni groups in Iraq. And this is at a time when the Sunnis of Iraq were feeling as though all sights were set on them. Now, the United States, as a part of its policy, was it courted Iraqi Shia and Iraqi Kurds in a sort of divide and conquer strategy, where they basically counted out the idea that Iraqi Sunnis, who were viewed as like the benefactors of the Saddam regime, they counted out all possibility that they would be able to bring them over to their side. And so really the people who were most open to collaboration with the U.S. occupation were Shia and Kurds. Now, this led to a schism in Iraqi society based on these sectarian lines. And because this Sunni population of Iraq felt so persecuted, they were open to the lowest common denominator of activity against their enemies, which was really just all-out sectarian war, and which, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi played to a T. He was known for attacking Shia civilians, attacking Shia shrines, attacking the U.S. occupation, and this essentially attracted the most hardcore and radical people from all over the world who saw the U.S. invasion and subsequent Shia Kurdish collaboration with this invasion to be a war against Sunnis. And so, yeah, I think that's the next building block in this story. I don't know if you guys wanted to ask any questions so far.
Yeah. So basically what you're saying is the divide that the United States created whenever they had their strategy of divide and conquer, that was what drew these extremely radical individuals to Zarqawi?
Yeah, and how this plays off of the greater Iraqi Sunni society is that when you have these, unfortunately, in these times of war, when people are in extremely precarious situations, they tend to coalesce around the most extreme and radical elements because they are typically the most, what's really valued in such an environment, at least in my view. I mean, thankfully, I've been one generation removed from any sort of civil conflict. Just as an aside, my family grew up during the Lebanese Civil War, and that's why I'm in the United States, essentially. It's because they all left. Now, in this kind of environment where, there could be somebody sniping at you, your neighbor could be sniping at you from a rooftop, a lot of people will coalesce around the most extreme and radical, the most prone to violence people. in their vicinity, which is typically people like Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, or on the Shia side you had Muqtada al-Sadr, and then on the Kurdish side you had all sorts of Kurdish tribal groups who were also very keen on bloodletting and extremely violent actions, to the point where you'd have guys setting off bombs in mosques, you would have people attacking religious processions, and really what it came down to, what happened in Iraq was it became a war of annihilation against one another's identity. And you could have seen this from the way that ISIS, or not ISIS, but Abu Musab al-Zarqawi's groups, the JTJ back then, were attacking. For example, what set off the Iraqi Civil War was an attack on a very, revered Shia holy site called the Askari Shrine. I think I mentioned that in the article. So it really became a war of, a zero-sum game. And a lot of people got sucked into that vortex. So what happened, ironically, in the beginning, Osama bin Laden was not for sectarian war. He wanted to focus on the United States. But it became more and more apparent that the people on the ground there were not willing to fight a war just against the United States. They viewed that as futile. They believed that they had to fight against the United States and anybody who was even nominally allied with the United States, which meant the Shia as well, because they also saw a threat from the Shia Arabs, as not so much the Kurds, because the Kurds, I guess, kind of kept to themselves. But the Shia and the Sunni Arabs were very intermixed in many areas of Iraq. And so began this, great separation where you saw ethnic cleansing on both sides throughout that region. And because of all these attacks, and because of just that culture, that milieu over in Iraq, which, I guess you could say prized this sort of very cynical bloodletting, you saw Abu Musab al-Zarqawi rise in stature to the point where if you wanted to get your foot in the door with this Salafi variant, or these Salafi groups in Iraq, you basically had to talk to the head honcho in Iraq at that time, which was Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. And so Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, who is his second in command, essentially came to this compromise where they said, okay, he's talking to Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, you brand yourself as an Al-Qaeda satellite here in Iraq, and we give you full access to all of our weapons networks and our monetary financial networks, which Al-Qaeda is deeply connected with over in the Arab Gulf. So that's what they did. And they stayed as an Al-Qaeda faction until, I believe, around 2013, when they split and became their own group, which we now know today as the Islamic State.
So let's move a little back before 2013, though, and go to 2011, because there's a lot of things that happened in 2011. Let's start with the Libyan Civil War. So how did that war and the fall of Gaddafi facilitate weapon shipments to ISIS and pave the way for them to have even more power?
Well, this is becoming much more apparent now, but Gaddafi turned out, he was essentially like a block, like a bulwark against the spread of weapons across not only northern Africa, but also sub-Saharan Africa. So you see all this stuff with ISIS affiliate Boko Haram, how they're really tearing up a lot of stuff down in Nigeria and sub-Saharan Africa. A lot of that is due to the fact that Gaddafi was kind of like this cork keeping all the arms, in Libya. Now that he's gone, all these arms are flowing down south as well as radiating, towards the Levant, towards Iraq. And you see all these weapons going in there, and you already have surrounding weak regimes and whatnot. And so you have all these guys who have access to these weapons now, and you see the subsequent destabilization of regimes across the Middle East, across sub-Saharan Africa. Now, with the fall of Gaddafi, now Gaddafi had a lot of weapons. He had been accruing them since Soviet times, and he had some pretty advanced weapons too. I think he had some pretty good Soviet era surface-to-air missiles, which had been used to take down Iraqi army helicopters. The Jordanian pilot who was captured last year and burned alive, I believe that he was also taken down. His plane was taken down by a surface-to-air missile that was procured from one of Gaddafi's arms stashes. You had ironically, you had both Sunnis and Shias in Libya around the time of the fall of Gaddafi, looting his compounds. I believe that in the article I wrote that you had Qatar and Saudi Arabia both making airlifts of Libyan arms from Libya to Syria, which were, the fuel for the fire in Syria and as well as in Iraq as well. So that's essentially what it was. He took out the head guy, and now all his weapons are on the market due to the fact that vacuum that he left was never filled by anybody.
Yeah, so let's add to that a little bit with Libyan and weapons and whatnot flowing to Syria. In the article, you talked about how Assad had offered to assist the U.S. in fighting against rebels, against Takfiri rebels, and the U.S. declined. And then, of course, we all know that the U.S. started backing some of those same rebel groups around 2011 as the Syrian Civil War broke out. So how did this flow of weapons from Libya and U.S. aid for these rebel groups in Syria, along with aid from the Gulf states, play into this as another building block in eventually getting to ISIS being created?
Well, all this stuff was instrumental. You have another thing I want to point out as to what happened in 2011 was that this is the time when the United States had pulled out of Iraq. So when they pulled out of Iraq, they left this very fractured system there. And originally you had the way that, if you remember the surge, I'm going back a little bit, but if you had remembered the surge of 2007, 2008, a big part of which was, if the viewers don't remember, or the listeners don't remember, that was essentially a U.S. change in strategy, where one of the pivotal parts of the strategy was to start to work with Iraqi Sunni tribes in order to put an end to attacks across Iraq. Now, we talked before about how this tribal society is really where ISIS, is housed and where it grows. The U.S. said, okay, we're going to start putting these guys on salary. We're going to start having them hunt ISIS for us. And unfortunately, what happened there was they created a state within a state, essentially. So you saw a bunch of money and weapons going to Sunni tribal leaders in Iraq, and on the other hand, you have an Iraqi government which you're trying to build up. It's very hard to bolster an Iraqi government while you're arming, some of the most, I guess you could say, socially backwards people, some of the most fiercely independent people, historically speaking, in the entire region. So you saw this rise of two states, essentially, this, U.S.-funded Iraqi tribal network, and then the Iraqi government itself, which was supposed to be inclusive. And when the United States withdrew, essentially what happened was the Sunnis all gravitated towards this, Sunni tribal nexus, which had been bolstered by United States money and arms. And then you saw the Iraqi government. Now, what happened after this was the Iraqi government started to purge Sunni ministers, and so you saw a reigniting of of a sectarian conflict in the wake of the U.S. withdrawal. Now, going back to Syria, the U.S. helped to fund and arm rebels to destabilize Assad. And the thing about Syria is that the vast majority of the population is located in the western portion of Syria. If you look at the map of Syria, you'll see that ISIS is mostly constrained to the eastern half of Syria. And Assad had to hold down the western half of Syria. That's where most of the population is located. And he was dealing with a huge number of rebel groups that were starting to emerge and were essentially funded and armed by the Arab Gulf and, by extension, the United States. So the power vacuum emerged, particularly in eastern Syria, where Syrian army manpower was much sparser. And on the other side of the Syrian border over in Iraq, you saw this growing sectarian conflict, which was coming back to the fore between the Sunni Iraqi tribes and what was quickly becoming a Shia Iraqi government. So ISIS saw an opportunity to expand from western Iraq into eastern Syria, and they took it. It gave them strategic depth in fights against the Iraqi army, and also they were, sticking it to what they viewed as a Shia enemy. As we know that, as we spoke of earlier, there's this huge enmity between this ISIS ideology and, if you want to call it Salafi, and the Shia Muslims as a whole. And I think, as most people know by now, Bashar al-Assad is not a Sunni. He is a Alawite, which is viewed as a Shia sect of Islam. So they had this narrative going where they're going to go take out this Shia dictator over in Syria, and that's essentially what they did. They took over eastern Syria, and that's what we have going on today. Essentially, unfortunately, you have, as a result of all this sectarian conflict, you're seeing the region really break down along its sectarian lines, not just in Iraq, but also in Syria. So what began as just an Iraqi fracture has since radiated towards much of the Middle East. And you see it happening in Syria, you see it happening in Yemen, you see it happening in the eastern part of the Arab Gulf, even over in Bahrain and eastern Saudi Arabia. So, yeah, I mean, that's how all these various events are very broadly related to one another. There's some detail that we could go into if you guys have any further questions.
So, is this really when we see it? Because we kind of got these tiered things going on right here. First, it's JTJ, then it's Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and now is it officially ISIS? At what point does it go from being Al-Qaeda in Iraq to actually ISIS as we know it today?
So I think that schism came about in 2013. I could be wrong. I haven't read my art. Unfortunately haven't read my article in several months.
Okay, I think it was in 2014.
Okay, so around 2014 there was a growing disagreement, or I think there was two main factors. One, the expansion into Syria saw ISIS grow in stature and popularity enormously, and so they realized, we don't need to be dependent on Al-Qaeda Central anymore. Those guys are over in Pakistan, Afghanistan. They're not actually here on the ground fighting. And by that point, they had taken over so much land over in Syria and Iraq that they became self-sufficient. They were no longer dependent on Al-Qaeda Central for money, and people were hitting them up directly, or I'm guessing that people were hitting them up directly at that point. I don't have, access to ISIS files or anything like that, but I'm guessing that by the time that they had taken over large swaths of eastern Syria, they didn't really need Al-Qaeda Central anymore. And so they essentially had a schism where Al-Qaeda began to fund its own group called Jabhat al-Nusra, or the Nusra Front. And and then ISIS had its own thing going on over in eastern Syria, and they had different philosophies, essentially. So Al-Qaeda wanted to focus mostly on attacking the Bashar al-Assad regime. They didn't want to go after. They didn't really want to set up a sort of Islamic State, in the sense, the way that the actual Islamic State wanted to set it up, because they had issues with local citizens in the past. Al-Qaeda had issues where they ended up alienating and antagonizing their fellow Sunnis. And this happened both in Afghanistan, and it also happened in Iraq to a considerable extent. So the reason why we even saw, for example, in the first place, many Sunni tribes go over to the United States was because they felt alienated by these foreigners coming in from, far-flung regions of the world, from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, all these different places, coming over and setting up shop in their territory. So ISIS, or Al-Qaeda, had taken this policy of, being much more friendly towards local populations and presenting themselves as just mere helpers, not so much, colonialists or, conquerors and things like that. ISIS, on the other hand, was much more keen on presenting itself as this conquering organization, completely stripped of notions of nationality, but focused solely on this Islamic identity, or its version of Islamic identity, which it was seeking to spread. So you had this operational difference, and then you had this philosophical difference as well, and you had the more practical interests, where ISIS simply did not need Al-Qaeda anymore. And so you have this split. So you have Al-Qaeda in Syria, which is the Nusra Front, and then you have the Islamic State.
So fast forwarding more or less to the present day, it seems like ISIS has had some really unique features that other jihadist groups haven't had. Now, you've touched on their ability to create or to have affiliates throughout the Middle East, but they've also been able to bring in a lot of foreign fighters. And I know in your article you talk about them being able to bring in experienced Chechen fighters. And in addition to this, ISIS has also been able to sell oil on the black market and capture oil fields and bring in revenue through that way. So can you talk a little bit about sort of these unique features that have helped ISIS grow and how that's carried into the present?
Yeah, I mean, ISIS is an extremely aggressive organization, not just militarily, but also in its propaganda and the way that it politics, essentially, with states like Turkey. So there's a lot of suspicion these days that Turkey buys ISIS oil, which is probably true, and so it's functioning like an independent state at this point, making it an unofficial state, but you see it trading with its neighbors. You see it pulling in pretty much anybody that they can who is friendly to their ideology. So we have like I said, we have these Chechens who have, and Chechnya has also been sort of a base for this sort of Al-Qaeda Salafist ideology for years and years. So ever since the Chechen wars with Russia, you saw a lot of Saudi support going over to Chechnya in the name of defending Islam. And so you saw the establishment, like I said before, you saw this establishment of this Islamic State, which was this sort of Islamic utopia, completely devoid of notions of nationalism, but really a place for the people that ISIS considers Muslims to harbor themselves.
So one last question before we wrap this up. But sure. How the U.S. obviously, along with France now rather famously, and several other countries have started airstrikes against ISIS, and we see Iran fighting against ISIS and the Kurds fighting against ISIS, and we've seen U.S. advisors going back to Iraq. So what effect have recent Obama administration policies played in ISIS's growth? And then what have we seen policies from other countries and other groups do to help or hurt ISIS's ability to grow?
So the thing is with this is that each of these factions has different goals, and obviously it's a complete mess at this point. I genuinely believe, and this is just my opinion, I don't think that Obama necessarily wants to destroy ISIS. I think he wants to contain ISIS. I think that the Iranians, they want to destroy ISIS. I think that people like Bashar al-Assad want to destroy ISIS. But I don't think NATO wants to destroy ISIS, and I don't think the United States or France want to destroy ISIS. And the reason for that being is that they need a bulwark against Iranian expansion throughout the Middle East. So if you saw, and unfortunately, the strongest Sunni faction in Western Iraq, Eastern Syria, is ISIS. So if you simply just destroy it, what you're going to see is you're probably going to see Iran run roughshod over the entire region. I don't think that the United States wants that, and I think they're content with simply containing it. Now, they've definitely have had it. The United States airstrikes have had an effect on Kurdish regions. So in the Kurdish regions, Kurdish groups have taken back a considerable amount of territory in northern Syria from ISIS. But ISIS still controls the core Sunni Arab areas. So far, unfortunately, Kurds have failed to lock down any ISIS strongholds, which are Sunni Arab in character, and mostly their gains have been constrained to areas which you could call Kurdish. You also have Russia, which is, in my opinion, the biggest force in Syria right now, which is conducting limited attacks against ISIS, mostly focusing on Syrian rebels in western Syria and the population centers. But we also see on the Russian side, their airstrikes on ISIS have led to some pretty big, even you can call some of them strategic gains in northern Syria. And there was an air base which had been under siege for a number of years, which, thanks to Russian assistance, the Syrian army was able to retake I think it was a couple months ago now. So you've seen the gradual peeling back of ISIS, thanks to Iranian, you could call them joint, but they're kind of disorganized. The thing is that ISIS has antagonized so many people worldwide that you have everybody with an air force is basically striking ISIS right now. So they're shrinking in Syria, and they're shrinking in Iraq as well. And what we see them doing now is that we see them moving into Libya, or a lot of people believe that they're going to start moving into Libya, where there's still a state of anarchy. So that's that's the effect that those airstrikes have had. You see the slow curtailing of ISIS growth, but at the same time, ISIS is still by no means destroyed. It's on the ropes right now, I believe, but it hasn't been knocked out.
Thank you so much for coming on the show and talking with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you. So we mentioned your Twitter handle. Is there a website we should direct our listeners to?
Yeah, the website is Late Empire. So it's LateEmpire.com. Twitter is, as you said at the beginning of the show, The Late Empire. Unfortunately, Late Empire is taken by somebody else, so I had to use the. And so, yeah, I mean, you can come see some of what I talk about on either of those two places. Although I guess I should forewarn your audience. My Twitter is pretty silly, so don't expect a lot of analysis all the time on that feed. So there you go. Thanks for having me on, guys.
All right, sure. Well, on that note, we want to remind our listeners to check out wakeupcallpodcast.com/ISIS-history. We'll link to your article, The History of the Islamic State, there. I highly encourage everyone to read it. And I know you have a big piece that you wrote maybe about a year ago on Hezbollah and their rise and their influence and sort of their place in Lebanon and how they rose out of the Lebanese Civil War. So, well, hopefully we can have you back on to discuss that at some point in the future.
Yeah, that would be great. Just let me know.
All right, definitely. All right, well, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, guys. You guys have a great day.
All right, you too.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.